Good morning, everyone. I'm Veda Vaidyanathan, an associate fellow at the foreign policy team at CSEP. And it is my job today to provide a little bit of context to the seminar and welcome you to this dialogue on why Afghanistan and Pakistan matter. Now, the description of Afghanistan, a country located at the intersection between Central, South, and West Asia, are many. The crossroads of civilization, a junction on the Silk Road, a battleground for proxy wars. It's been called the graveyard of empires and also the heart of Asia. An Afghan scholar, Zubair Salahi, cautions against this usage, the heart of Asia. He says it is a heart whose volatile beat affects security interests of neighboring countries and can change the course of global politics. Portrayals of Pakistan, on the other hand, sway between Aisha Jalal's version of a post-colonial state that embodies the complexities of navigating its place in the world, on one extreme, and the other, a land that has drifted into geopolitical oblivion. Then there's the other dimension, the Af-Pak relationship. The two countries have a long history of tense relations defined by sovereignty concerns, security interests, geopolitical dynamics, cross-border ties, and so on. Pakistani academics Shashad Akhtar and Arshad Ali argue that the attitudes and policies of Pakistani decision makers concerning Afghanistan have historically been conditioned by concerns about their close relationships between India and Afghanistan. Now, close and historic this relationship might be, but the Afghan crisis has created serious fault lines in this relationship. The lead of the foreign policy vertical at CSEP, Constantino Xavier, for instance, has argued how India's failure to help Afghan friends during a crisis is not just a moral issue, but he calls it a strategic liability. Our panelists today have written extensively on this. Allow me a few moments to introduce them, but also provide some context to today's dialogue. Ambassador Vivek Katju is former Secretary West of Ministry of External Affairs and India's former ambassador to Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Thailand. In the Indian Express, Ambassador Katju explained why India must engage the Taliban and how the Taliban isn't a monolith. It has a significant tribal and regional contradictions. To its mixture of Deobandi and Wahhabi theologies, it also has pragmatists. In this context, he highlights 2 points. One, engagement with the Taliban would at least give an opportunity to convey Indian concerns directly and encourage those elements within the group who wish to open up its diplomatic choices. And 2, the argument that the diplomatic door must be kept open for Pakistan, a country that has made the use of terror a part of its security doctrine on India because it's a neighbor, while it can be shut on Taliban, is facile because Afghanistan directly impacts Indian security. Ambassador Rakesh Sood is Distinguished Fellow, Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and India's former ambassador to France, Nepal, and Afghanistan. In an article titled Redefining India's Role in Afghanistan, he explains that not only does India have historical and civilizational ties with Afghanistan, it is also one of the country's biggest regional development partners, committing $3 billion alone in the last 2 decades. This includes more than 500 projects spread across each of the 34 provinces in critical areas of power, water supply, road connectivity, healthcare, education, and so on. Since 2021, ICCR has granted admissions to more than 3,000 students. The UNDP has partnered with India to train Afghan civil servants, and more than 60,000 Afghans have returned to rebuild their country after completing their education in India. Ambassador Jaimini Bhagwati is a Distinguished Fellow at CSEP and former High Commissioner of India to the UK and Ambassador to the EU. In his book, The Promise of India, he explains how Afghanistan continues to grapple with competing jealousies across rival clans and the ploys of great powers. He describes how gestures of support from India have been welcomed by most ethnic and political groups in Afghanistan, and how Vajpayee and his successors have been careful not to be identified with any one faction, and instead to be seen as helping to improve living conditions across all communities in this war-ravaged country. So it is to discuss this complex geopolitical canvas that is weighed down by the past, marred by the self-interest of a powerful few, where engagement and development appears to come at a moral and strategic cost, that this stellar panel today will deliberate on the question, why Afghanistan and Pakistan matter. So on behalf of all of my colleagues here, I'd like to welcome the 3 panelists to CSEP. I'd also like to welcome everyone in the audience to CSEP. Ambassador Bhagwati, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you. That was an excellent introduction. I'm sure everybody benefited. Can everybody hear me? I've got a mic here, but I can't make out whether it's working. It's working. Okay, thank you. Can we have those two slides up? There's one slide with the map of the region and another slide with some basic numbers. But while they are doing that, let me just, there it is. If you look at the map, I don't know whether for people at the back, it's clearly visible, but you can see all the countries that Afghanistan has on its borders. To its west, it has Iran, followed by Iran, of course, oil and gas rich. Then Turkmenistan, any amount of gas there. I remember the president telling the Minister of State for External Affairs when we visited Turkmenistan that please tell me how much gas you want. I can give you any amount of gas, but I can only give it to you at my border. So very gas rich. Next is Uzbekistan, which has both gas, oil, and coal, but not as much gas as Turkmenistan or as much oil as Kazakhstan. Then you have Tajikistan, which among all these Central Asian countries speaks archaic Persian, not some form of Turkish. And then you have China. Next, only about a 90-kilometer long border between Afghanistan and China, and you have the Uyghurs there who are all Sunni Muslims. And then, of course, you have Pakistan and so on. The reason why I point all this out is it will lead me to my first question, which will be to Ambassador Vivek Katju, which is that, you have this immensely rich region, rich both in terms of gas and oil. So obviously, when there is honey, the bees and other such creatures flock to it. So do we want instability stemming from Afghanistan to Central Asia? By the way, Russia today and Soviet Union earlier depends a lot on lower cost labor from Central Asian countries. They go there and they remit money somewhat like Indians do out of West Asia. Now, having said that, so we would not like instability to gather pace there, and from there somehow find its way into India. So, Vivek, what do you think? What are the prospects, given all the history of Afghanistan, and we have a strange government there. I mean a government which feels that women should not be educated, and I'll stop there. That's strange enough for me in terms of stability and instability radiating out of Afghanistan. I recognize, of course, that Pakistan doesn't want religious fundamentalism to in any way mitigate or overthrow the command and control that the Pakistani armed forces have over their own country. Having said that, is Pakistan enough of a buffer against possible difficulties that might stem out of an unstable Afghanistan, which destabilizes Central Asia? Vivek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jaimini. A pleasure being with you and Rakesh. Afghanistan has been unstable for over 5 decades. So it's not a new development. I think many scholars trace that the beginning of Afghan instability to 1978, when Dawood was overthrown by the communists. But I feel that one has to go back and to the Dawood coup itself, which overthrew the monarchy. And Dawood, as you know, was Zahir Shah's cousin, but he declared Afghanistan as a republic. So from that period on, 1973, Afghanistan has gone through Afghan nationalist rule, Dawood along with the communists. Then the period of the communists with the Russian ingress or the Soviet ingress into Afghanistan on Christmas week of 1979. And that lasted till February of 1989, when the Soviets withdrew. Najib lasted for 3 years, surprisingly, when he thought that he collapsed. The Pakistanis tried their best, but he managed to hold on, and it's only when the Soviets collapsed, Soviet Union went into the dustbin of history, that he could hold no longer, because his supporters thought that he was going, and they abandoned him. And then came the Mujahideen for a couple of years, and then the Taliban, and we know the Taliban were there for 5 years, and after that 20 years of the Americans engaged in the forever war. So what happened on 15th of August 2021, to my mind, is a continuing chapter in that instability. Now, instability in Afghanistan has never come to us. It does impact our security interests, because I think there is a nexus, howsoever slight, between what's happening in Afghanistan and the situation in Kashmir, and we can discuss that at some length if you wish, but it isn't much. So the presumption that what's happening now in Afghanistan is impacting on us geostrategically, I think needs to be examined further. That's point one. Point two, and I think this was a question that you had sent to us, whether our Islamic community, the Muslim community, would be impacted by Afghanistan. I haven't seen any of this. I don't think that theologically Indian Muslims look up to Afghanistan. Certainly, when Mullah Umar was declared as the Amirul Momineen, no one in India accepted that. No Indian Muslim said he's the Amir. And his successors too. I mean, they've assumed that title, but it made no effect. In fact, it's the other way around. Afghan Islam has been impacted by the Deobandi influences. Now, we don't know exactly what is the relationship, what is the influence that Deoband directly has, or whether it is through its surrogates in Pakistan. And in addition, Salafi influences coming from the Gulf. So I don't think that that is a problem either. Yes, what has happened, and that's the last point I'll make. I'm sorry, being a little long on this. What's happened is that Afghan Islam has been impacted from influences from outside. There was a traditional Islam in Afghanistan. It was different in different parts. In the Pashtun heartland, in the west, it was insular. I don't think it 19th century apart, in the 20th century, there's been any notable Afghan scholar who has attracted attention, broad theological scholar. But these influences from outside brought in a sharpness in Afghan Islam. And I recollect Ahmad Shah Massoud telling me once that he doesn't understand the Islam of the Taliban. And this was prior to the destruction of the the Bamiyan Buddhist. He said, I don't. And he was a very pious Muslim. I think I'll show you.
Thank you, Vivek. That was very useful. Before I ask Rakesh a question, let me just tell everyone here, I have benefited a lot from the fact that we have been together since first year in college. But I don't know whether he will say the same. Hopefully, at least in public, he'll say the same. We have some numbers up there. It's difficult to read from back there, and it's difficult for me to read. Just to switch things around, Afghanistan's GDP, by the way, the IMF does not provide any numbers on Afghanistan's economy, presumably because it's too dangerous to go to Kabul or whatever the reason. But Afghanistan is blank in the World Economic Outlook of the International Monetary Fund. But as one could have predicted, the CIA does, in its World Fact Book, have numbers on Afghanistan's economy. So the number for, I don't like nominal dollars. I always prefer purchasing power parity numbers. In purchasing power parity numbers, Afghanistan's GDP as of 2022, not 23, there's a footnote there which says it is for 2022. Even the CIA could not get numbers for 2023 as yet. So it's only 73 billion. Now you compare Pakistan, which is roughly 20 times more at 1.5 trillion. And of course, let's forget about India and China and so on. It's all there. So later on, you can have a look. The reason why I mention this is that if you look at it in terms of population, Afghanistan's population is only about a fifth of that of Pakistan. But its GDP is what? About a 20th of that of Pakistan. So if Pakistan has civil and other forms of unrest and other kinds of difficulties, and this is an average number, we all know GDP per capita doesn't indicate income distribution in the country. One can safely assume that there are tremendous, should we say, differences between the bottom 10% and the top 10% in Afghanistan. So, Rakesh, my question to you is that, again, somewhat similar, given all this, just what are the superpowers? Are the US, the EU, the NATO, Russia, China, what kind of interest are they taking in a place like Afghanistan with these kinds of income disparities and such low income? Is it copper? Is it rare earths? What interest do they have, if any, both in terms of, both in strategic terms and also economic terms?
Thank you, Jaimini. Let me say I have benefited a lot. Let me make that very clear right at the outset and put that to rest. No, but I want to thank you for inviting me, and it's good to be here with Vivek. And I can see there is a lot of interest, even though Afghanistan doesn't figure very much in the newspapers, either in India or, for that matter, in the international press these days. Your first question when you said instability in Afghanistan, Afghanistan's geography, I mean, you have a map there, but if you look at that map and convert it into history, historically, Afghanistan, it is a pretty harsh kind of a terrain, which would be more visible in a physical map of the region. And secondly, it has always been a borderland state. It's been on the frontier. So if you go back in history, if you look at it has been on the periphery of whether it was the Mauryan Empire, it has been on the periphery whether it was the Mughal Empire, it has been on the periphery whether it was the British Indian Empire. And so it marked the frontier of separation, because those days with empires, you didn't have boundaries, very clean cut boundary lines. And it was a frontier of separation from what? It was from the Persians. That was an empire. The Turkics, you know, you were talking about the different languages. That was an empire. For British India, it was the Tsarist Russia. That was the empire. So it was always a frontier of separation. And this geography, coupled with the terrain that it had, which was a harsh terrain, which created a lot of divisions among people. Access, movement was not very easy from one region of Afghanistan to the other. So there was obviously a tribal structure. So in sociological terms, people call it a segmentary lineage system, which is based much more on kinship rather than on hierarchy. Another word for this is a syphilis society, which is a headless society. Again, head meaning a hierarchical. So this led to a kind of certain tribal traditions. I mean, you heard of the Pashtuns, who account for, which is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. And one of the characteristics is that you have these blood feuds that last for generations. You know, because it becomes very difficult to resolve feuds. You know, it continues and continues and continues. So you don't have a hierarchical society where these things can be resolved by fiat. And I think that this is one of the characteristics of Afghan society. So when Vivek was talking about 1973, when Zahir Shah was deposed by his own cousin, Sardar Dawood, which then led to the declaration of republic and then the coming up of the communist movement, the PDPA and all the rest of it, and then the Soviet intervention and so on and so on. Even if you go further back in history, you find that its existence as a country has been a loosely governed country. And that is part of its, which fits in much better with its tribal characteristics. And in fact, one of the mistakes that the Americans did, according to me, was that they introduced a system, you know, a presidential system, because that is the system of government that they are most familiar with, without the institutions of checks and balances having grown up in that soil. And so as a result, you had centralization, you had corruption, you had all the rest of it, and we saw what happened after 21 years. Interests, because of the fact that it is a frontier, it's a borderland. So obviously there are interests, both of the regional powers as well as the major powers. China is both a regional power and a major power. The Americans have global interests. I mean, Iran may not be, Iran may be involved in so many other theaters, but certainly as a bordering state of both Afghanistan and Pakistan has a very strong interest. The Pakistanis have had long-term interest in Afghanistan because the Durand Line, which was an outcome after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the Durand Line was created in 1893. It's an arbitrary line, and it divides the Pashtun community. As I said, the Pashtuns constitute about, I think, about 45, 47%, below 50% of the population of Afghanistan. So let's say if the population is about 40 million, as has been mentioned, so Pashtuns would be, say, about 17 million out of that. At the same time, Pashtuns constitute about 17% of the population of Pakistan. So if you look at that, then there would be about twice as many Pashtuns living in Pakistan, say 35 million or thereabouts, or more slightly. And They speak the same language, they have tribal affinities, it's the same tribes. So the Durand line, therefore, has always been a source of great discomfort. And for a long time after Pakistan was created, there was one country that voted no to Pakistan's membership of the United Nations at that time in 1947-48. And that was Afghanistan, because they said this country does not have a settled boundary. They always felt that the Durand line as a boundary between British Indian Empire and Afghanistan, done in 1893, was an unfair thing, and it was never accepted as a boundary. So once Pakistan became its own country, as it were, and needed a proper defined boundary, they've tried their level best, even after the coming in of the Taliban. They've tried to have a barbed wire fence, etc., but it seldom lasts. And that's one of the difficulties. The other interest that has often been talked about in Afghanistan are its natural resources. These are largely mineral resources. The first of these studies was carried out by the Soviet Union in the period of the 1980s. The Americans then carried out certain studies, oil and gas in the Oxus River, the Amu Darya Basin, copper mines during the Karzai days, when there was a feeling that perhaps it would be stable. The Chinese were given the leasing rights to the copper resources, Mezainak mines. But nothing much happened, because how do you get the stuff out? And there's no railway there. We were given the leasing rights to the Haji Gak iron ore resources. Our people were there for some time, but then once again, it was the same issue. How do you get it out from there? And so it has remained a completely untapped kind of a resource. Today, will these natural resources provide enough of an incentive for commercial interests to be able to come in and impose a degree of, or induce a degree of stability so that these can be economically exploited? I frankly doubt it, because of the nature of the society that exists and the nature of the regime that is there. I mean, the fact is that there has been enormous amount of outflow of the local population at different stages. It happened first when the monarchy was abolished. It happened next when the Soviets walked in. It happened when the communists, when Najibullah fell. It happened again when the Taliban came in. It happened with the Americans coming in. There was somewhat of a return, particularly from the Western countries. But then once the Americans left, once again, there was a population exit. So given that, given these kind of conditions, and as you said, the further restrictions that are being put on education and all the rest of it, and the kind of education that exists, I don't think that we have a situation where these resources will provide enough of an incentive for commercial interests to be able to come in and undertake the risks that are associated with it.
Thanks, Rakesh. Moving on, we've all heard about the drug problem in Afghanistan in terms as a producer of drugs. I don't know whether the refinement into the kind of drugs that people around the world take. Vivek, I'd like to ask you, in fact, I'd like to ask both of you one by one, maybe Vivek first. Was US-occupied Afghanistan more in the interest of Pakistan than a Afghan-ruled Afghanistan? I mean, when I say Afghan, Rakesh has already explained the differences between the various ethnic groups in Afghanistan. But I'm asking a loaded question for the Pakistani establishment, which includes obviously mostly their military, their armed forces, would they be more comfortable with the US occupied Afghanistan than a Taliban ruled Afghanistan? And I'm going into very dangerous territory here now, because I'm talking about who makes money out of those drugs. How is it better for one group or the other within Afghanistan and within Pakistan?
I'll come to this, but permit me to
Please.
respond to a few things. I have great admiration for Rakesh's scholarship on Afghanistan. I learned about Afghanistan directly from Afghan leaders during the Civil War and sitting down with them on various places, drinking endless pots of green and black tea. So I'm no scholar, and that's why I have great admiration for it. But I think the problem with considering Afghanistan is the frontier, and I agree with this, that it's at what stage in history do you look upon any country as a frontier or as a center which has frontiers? We know that from our own history that Afghan rule was established here, and at that stage Afghanistan considered India as a frontier. So it was, I think the problem with history is the present Afghan state goes back to 1747, when Ahmad Shah Abdali, who's of course considered to be a scoundrel here, but who in Afghanistan is hailed as the founder of the state, especially by the Pashtuns, sort of defined the present contours of Afghanistan and roughly. And the important thing that emerged after the mid-18th century was that the Pashtuns all across, and that means both sides of the Durand, considered the land between the two rivers, the Indus and the Amu Darya, to be their land. Whoever may live there, that they had the right of domination. And I think that feeling still persists. So if there's a Tajik or there's an Uzbek, the Hazaras are of course the downtrodden. Though the Pashtuns don't accept it. And this is something that the British also bought. And the Americans were influenced by the Brits. I think clearly the fact that, and it's an open secret, that in the elections which were conducted, the presidential elections that were conducted, the Americans decided that Karzai should be succeeded by Ashraf Ghani, who showed his mettle by showing a very clean pair of heels as the Taliban approached Kabul, was because he was an Ahmadzai Pashtun. And they didn't want Abdullah, who is a Giljai Pashtun, but whose mother is a Pancheri and who politically was affiliated with Ahmad Shah Massoud. So this is one fact that I think we've got to bear in mind, because the curious thing which has happened now and is that the Taliban, which is essentially a Pashtun force or a Pashtun group, and we know that there are divisions among them, have now been able to establish their sway all over. And quite frankly, the rapidity with which they moved in 2021, capturing the border crossing and then sweeping through Badakhshan into the northern plains across the Hindu Kush, was quite spectacular. And that was the Pakistan helping militarily. Now, will this change in Afghanistan, this ethnic situation? As of now, I don't see any possibility. The second is, and I think I agree with Rakesh, that when the constitution was being framed in Afghanistan in 2003, I was ambassador there, and I suggested to my Afghan friends that they should look at our own, the Indian one. Because I thought that, kind of a quasi-federal structure that we had be helpful. But two things intervened. The first was that the Pashtuns, both among the former Mujahideen, but more the expatriate Pashtuns who came back, convinced the Western powers, and America was, of course, in the lead, that Afghanistan's stability was dependent on a strong central authority. And that was a mistake. Time has shown that that was a mistake. So there, it wasn't, which brings me to this point that immigrant communities, I've noticed, have always had a profound influence in Western states on how they frame their policies towards countries.
Resulting in negative outcomes. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. For example, I mean, let me share this with you, and it will, since the confidential, is it, or is it public? You put it out. Even if you put it out, doesn't matter. 25 years ago, a colleague and I were in America, and there we were having a chat with the Americans on Iran. And when I suggested that the Vilayat-e-Faqih was there to stay, oh, there was horror in the room, including people from the agency. So they thought that it was tottering. The whole Khomeini, post-Khomeini system couldn't last. It's been 25 years in regime change and the whole focus on regime change. It doesn't happen. Why was this happening? Because I think there's great comfort, and this happened in Afghanistan too. People who lived say, in the West, were fluent in the language, in English, and like Ghani, for example, skillful, World Bank, skillful, spoke the kind of idiom, unlike the Mujh, who were rustic folk, or the Taliban, people on the Taliban. So I think they had an enormous influence. And they said centralization, the Pashtuns among them. So centralized. And on society, I agree with Rakesh. So society has changed enormously, except that during the last 50 years, society started changing during the monarchical period, starting from, say, the 1950s gradually, and in the 60s, there was this great division between the Islamists and the communists. But today, I think we don't have a real fix on the complexities of Afghan society, because there hasn't been any great scholarly work on. I've seen some stuff here and there, but the situation doesn't warrant it. And on drugs, look, it's fascinating that you mentioned this, because I think if you look at the drug issue, the original opium poppy producing area was the Golden Triangle. And once the squeeze was put there, then the international drug cartels, the opium cartels, the heroin cartels, they needed a space. where this could be grown, and the space they chose was the frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan. At one time, there was greater production on the Pakistan side, but there was much too much of heat, so they pushed the drug production across. And the three traditional provinces in Afghanistan where drug was produced was Helmand, which was of course always number one. The second was Nangarhar, and third was Badakhshan. But then came a time when it spread all over for a brief period. And that happened because the British, who were made in charge of drug eradication, decided to compensate farmers so that against growing the opium poppy. The result was that in order to get compensation, they all started growing. But that wasn't traditional. So in most areas, it stopped after a while, but these areas, it continued. Now, we know that roughly the proportion of opium to heroin is 1:6, and it's converted largely in Afghanistan. And then it flows mainly to Europe, though now it's coming into Pakistan and through Pakistan across the border here and going elsewhere, Africa and different routes. The other thing which I must mention is ephedrine. And that is becoming a major issue. Now, who is getting the money? The farmer gets a pittance because the rough estimate is that at every stage, the increase is 10 times. So if the farmer gets X, then the next stage it's 10X, and thus it proceeds. Are the Pakistanis gaining money? Of course, the Pakistanis do. I've often felt that some of it is funneled into certain porters in Pakistan for it's easy money, and it can be used for with plausible deniability, those funds. It is an issue. At one stage, 1/3 of the GDP of Afghanistan was from narcotics. Today, I think it's less. But for the last few days, I've chatted with a few friends in Kabul, and they said it's still there, it's vitiating Taliban structure too.
I'll turn to Rakesh and ask him for his views on this whole difficult, dangerous, and what should I say, negative aspects of the drug trade, and how it could destabilize Pakistan further. We are all familiar with this famous novel called Moth Smoke and the use of drugs in Pakistani society. I think the author now lives in New York. He's probably not welcome in Pakistan. But if you would like to share your thoughts on this whole issue.
I think Vivek is absolutely right about the British being in charge of counter narcotics in Afghanistan after 2001 when the Americans go in. The Americans are reported to have spent over $10 billion on counter narcotics operations. And the outcome was that Afghanistan at that stage was accounting for 80% of the global opium. I mean, if we need one case study of how not to do something, that's it. It was one of the most disastrous experiments in counter narcotics that has ever been done. And this is not just an Indian speaking. The UN has a narcotics agency, and they were also aghast. But then the money was being spent by the Americans, so that was it. And that is one of the issues. When also the role of what the expat population coming back. I mean, that is key because the Americans had a very strong ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, who was a Pashtun. He and Ashraf Ghani had left the country together almost side by side. Both studied at the American University in
Beirut.
Beirut, in Beirut. And then both went on.
Which doesn't
to make
exist
their-
anymore.
Yeah, and then both went on to America to make their respective careers. Khalilzad was there as the American ambassador. Very, very strong, very and very influential.
Ambitions to be president.
Yes, I mean, he had thought that he would certainly be at least vice president or president. He did reasonably well. I mean, he went from there to Iraq, another disastrous example of an interview, and then ended up as their PR in New York. Had worked earlier with Rand Corporation during the 1990s, which is when I got to know him for the first time. But I mean, this only indicates as to whether it is the influence of the expat community or whatever. But the fact is that because the model that they were familiar with was the American model, which is what was tried to be done. And this is the other thing. I mean, even when, let's say, I'll give you another example. When General Petraeus was in Iraq, they did what was called the surge in Iraq. Obama comes in 2008 and 2009 January, he takes over. He orders a review. If you remember, among his first statements was that one is a useless war, namely Iraq, and one is unnecessary. But by the time he comes in and he says, now we need to wind up this. So he orders a complete review of the policy. The surge is introduced, but at the same time that the surge is being announced of forces, because the situation has grown from bad to worse from 2004 onwards, by the time he comes in 2009. But nobody is willing to accept why or face up to why this has happened, because it is, as your question earlier was, how does Pakistan benefit? Because this was the Pakistani game. To run with the hare, hunt with the hound kind of thing. I mean, they couldn't take on Pakistan. Pakistan was too important for them, both in terms of keeping the supply lines open and all the rest of it. And so they were unwilling to accept the fact that they were being made a fool of. So Pakistan had to be bribed, occasionally threatened a little bit, but then bribed again. But it was too important, and the Pakistanis were able to play this game extremely successfully. It is not for nothing. I think they received something like $36 billion in terms of fees for allowing some of their routes to be used for providing supplies, for ferrying supplies across from Karachi onto the international troops, International Security Assistance Force. Also, so in some ways, Obama got frustrated with this, because when he ordered this review, and it was concluded that he is going to, and he expanded the US presence, which was about 30,000 troops at that point in time, in 2 stages to 100,000. Other troop contributing countries also pitched in. So by 2011, it was something like 140, 150,000 troops. But then he also pinned down the generals to say, how long will it take you to bring the situation under control? And so the answer that he got from Stanley McChrystal and the others, Petraeus and so on, was 18 months. So when he did the announcement of the surge in, I think, August of 2009 or something like that, he said, so I'm announcing this surge and the drawdown will begin in 2014, which is what led to the famous Taliban joke, you have the watches, we have the time. And but as a strategic move, it was a disaster to announce that, okay, but true to his word, he announced closure of combat operations, drew down to 8,500 by the time he left, and Trump took over. But by that time, he had already opened negotiations with the Taliban. Doha office had been set up in 2013. Before that, what had been preconditions for talks with the Taliban, namely laying down of arms, accepting the constitutional framework, and cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. These were supposed to be preconditions for opening talks. These then became outcomes. So it was decided, there was this big speech that was made to say that, oh, well, if the Taliban are already going to agree to this, then what are we going to negotiate on? So let these be the outcome of negotiations. So that is how the gradual weakening of the position against Taliban began. This was music to the ears of the Pakistanis. But they would have liked to prolong it a little longer because it was extremely beneficial. Now, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan has never been a particularly happy experience. I mean, it's always been a bit of a difficult experience. There is this famous story, which I'm sure Aziz Khan, common friend of ours, who served as the Pakistani ambassador in Kabul during the Taliban regime during the 1990s. He's told us this story. And when the then DGISI goes to meet Mullah Omar in Kandahar, and they talk of the Durand Line. And as I was mentioning earlier, the Durand Line has never really been accepted as a boundary by the Afghans, particularly the Pashtuns. So he talks to Mullah Omar and he says, it would be a good thing if we have this converted as a boundary or something like that. So Mullah Omar, who's at that time the Amirul Momineen, he turns to the general and says, between brothers, you talk of boundary? And that's the end of that conversation. So, I mean, considering that the Taliban in the 1990s or the Taliban in post-2021 were, the Taliban in the 1990s were straight out of the madrasas in the FATA, in the federally administered tribal areas, in the frontier areas of Pakistan. Taliban in 2021 were far smarter. They had been running this international office in Doha. They had interacted with diplomats, journalists, you name it. They had attended international peace conferences in Istanbul, in Mari, in Urumqi, in Moscow, and so on. So they were a much more savvy crowd in that sense. But nothing doing. I mean, Mullah brother was not interested in any of this boundary business. And today, there is one additional difficulty that the Pakistanis have, which is that as the Taliban which had their sanctuaries in Pakistan, carried out their battle against the international troops, particularly the American presence in Afghanistan, a host of other Islamic militant movements came into the region. And of course, there came this homegrown Pakistani militant movement, which then got the label of TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Now, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, was very enthused with the success of the Taliban. So, I mean, the Pakistani establishment by this time was getting a little cheesed off with the success of the TTP. You probably recall that famous army public school in Peshawar.
Yes. Horrible
incident.
Horrible incident.
Where 150 kids got killed. Most of them children of Pakistani military people. So And the Pakistani army tried to put a lot of pressure on the Taliban regime now in Kabul, saying, you know, you've got to control these guys. And so twice the Taliban helped broker a ceasefire so that talks could take place between the army, Pakistan army, and the TTP. Both times the talks collapsed on a very simple matter. The TTP just said, look, we're not asking you for control over entire Pakistan. We're only asking you to do what you've done for Taliban. You've given them their own territory. So you give us our territory, you get out of the tribal areas, leave it to us. You take your army out, we'll manage it, we'll create the law and order, we'll do the revenue collection, we'll have everything else. You don't have to come inside. That's all. Now, for the army, Pakistan army to accept that for within their own country is obviously impossible. And that's the other backlash which they have. So right now you continue to have this ding dong. So from all aspects, Pakistan would have been much happier had the Americans continued to stay on.
Good. That's what I
Good.
thought. I'm glad an expert has confirmed.
I have a,
Slightly different
Slightly
point of view.
different. Good.
Please go ahead.
I think Pakistan was always ambivalent about the Americans. They saw the advantages accruing to them in terms of money, etc. But they also saw that the Kabul government, whether it was Karzai or Ashraf Ghani later, and others, were building very strong ties with India. The first strategic partnership that the Karzai government entered into was with India. So they didn't like this at all. And one of their basic complaints to the Americans was initially to keep India out of the strategic sector. So India was not allowed to train the army, had nothing to do with the army, keep it out with the police, etc. The intelligence, they wanted it out, but the intelligence, the Pancheris controlled, and we had old connections with the Pancheris, so that was the difference. They thought that with the Taliban coming, they would have greater purchase. But here they made a fundamental mistake. Why they thought so was because the Taliban leadership and its very substantial number of Pashtuns have now deep interests in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. They have properties in Pakistan, they own industries in Pakistan. They thought that they'll be able to manipulate these. What they've forgotten, and surprisingly, because many of the people who dealt with the Pakistanis who dealt with the Taliban were Pashtuns themselves. What they forgot is that it's not easy to control the Pashtuns. The old saying that you can't own one, you can rent one, you can't own one. So they had hoped that they'll get greater purchase on India. And, of course, what Rakesh mentioned, the TTP. What they forgot was that no Kabul government in Kabul would want to be controlled by Pakistan. Now, at the moment, there's a cleavage, to my mind, there's a cleavage within the Taliban. The Haqqanis have far greater contacts with the ISI and the Pakistani establishment. So they are more willing to adjust. But the guys in Kandahar, they no. For them, it's a no.
Interesting.
And last point. So it's no secret the Taliban have reached out to us. Like in the old days, the Pancheris reached out to us. If there are inhibitions in dealing with the Taliban, They lie here. I think there's this technical team, and to my mind, we should have converted it into a regular, started calling it an embassy. Everyone else has. I think the Russians have even changed the ambassador, the Chinese have changed the ambassador, etc. Which brings me to the final point. Domestic issues should never impact foreign policy.
Well, that's something to remember. But this is a useful point for me to turn to Rakesh, and then again back to you, because you have now said a little bit about it. What should India be doing under the circumstances that we have, not just in Afghanistan, but also its relationship with Pakistan and Pakistan more broadly? We are not in government anymore, Rakesh. Imagine you are the Prime Minister.
Let me start with
He's
Pakistan.
ducking it. He's ducking
No, let me start with Pakistan. The fact that Pakistan is a neighbor is given. That's not going to change. Now, Pakistan, for its own reasons, has its own internal dilemmas. We can have a long session on it in terms of its search for identity, the distortion of its polity with the frequent bouts of military rule, and even today, even though it is, Pakistan is a strange thing. It is not Saudi Wahhabi kind of a state. It is not an Islamic revolutionary state like Iran. It is not a democracy. It is not a dictatorship. What exactly is it? That is part of its own internal process, and Pakistanis are grappling with it and to the best they can. So, but the fact is, as far as India is concerned, so comes the question of how do we manage our relations with Pakistan
and Afghanistan.
Well,
in the overall.
Yeah. So, Pakistan is a strategic challenge for us. We don't have the resources. Although you have these various figures and it is 1/5 or whatever, the defense budget is about 1/8. The GDP per capita is about not that there is a difference now. Till about 2005, 2007, the per capita GDP in PPP terms, Pakistan was higher than India. It's only after that that
Not anymore.
Yeah, after 2007, 8 or thereabouts, it started shifting. Part of the price, you can say, is the cost of rearing Taliban. But that apart, I don't think today India has either the financial or the military resources to be able to implement a strategic solution to the strategic challenge that Pakistan poses. So what different governments have done in Delhi is they have made tactical adjustments. Now, tactical approaches will only yield tactical outcomes. But what happens is that a particular government takes an approach, and then that policy becomes, perhaps it is the optimal policy at the time. If you recall, nuclearization 1998, Vajpayee's visit to Lahore, followed by Kargil, and so on. Vajpayee still invites Musharraf to Agra. Vivek can talk about Agra.
Yeah, he was there. Yes.
And then you have a ceasefire declared, negotiated while the Vajpayee government was still there in 2003. Carried forward by Manmohan Singh government, the back channel between Tariq Aziz and Sati Lamba lasts till goes aground. They come pretty close. There is talk of a 4-point formula, etc., etc. Border trade in Kashmir opens up across the certain checkpoints. Movement of people is facilitated, things like that. And then you get Mumbai in 2008, stalls. Once again, there is a resumption of some kind of a dialogue, 2011-13, composite this, that. Modi goes there, tries to, kickstart a dialogue at that time. Pakistan is also going through its own internal issues. And eventually that dialogue collapses. So now, so each of these is a tactical kind of a solution. So what happens is that tactical approaches can only provide you with tactical outcomes. They cannot substitute for strategic solutions. So, but it becomes, every leader gets wedded to his or her own tactical approach. And then you think that that is strategy. We need to accept that that is not strategy. So you must be prepared to let your tactical approaches evolve. That is, and that becomes in my view, that is a strategic requirement. Now, the fact that both countries are nuclear would automatically indicate that you can't go to war with each other. I mean, even a small tactical kind of a weapon that Pakistanis are, let's say you have half a kiloton to say 5 kilotons, then you have a radius of something like a kilometer, which would be completely devastated, and given the urban and given the population density.
Radioactive fallout.
And if you have something like a 35 kiloton, and then you're looking at a 5 kilometer radius, which is completely devastated. So it's war in that sense is totally out of the realm of the likely this thing. Do you think that that should have reassured Pakistan that there cannot be a repeat of 71? Because Pakistan always, but the Pakistan military always had in its head about a repeat of 71, where they lost half their country. Shouldn't that reassure Pakistan? It should. But somehow or the other, that goes contrary to the Pakistan military's own thinking, because if they get that security, then how do they justify their role within the domestic politics of Pakistan? So, but this is part of their own internal dilemma. For us, the challenge is to continue to evolve tactical approaches that can ensure that there is a degree of stability and management of the relationship. When it comes to Afghanistan, I think this thing of the enemy's enemy, and the Taliban to that extent not having the best of relationship with the regime in Islamabad/Rawalpindi. I would say that we were very, very slow in reading the writing on the wall. I mean, the whole world from the time, as I mentioned to you, 2011, the Americans changed the goalposts in terms of preconditions and outcomes. 2013, an international office is opened in Doha for the Taliban. Negotiations begin. Different countries, Turkey, Russia, China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they're all hosting peace conferences and inviting Taliban delegations from Doha because their travel is being facilitated. I mean, the writing is on the wall. And all these countries are establishing talks with the Taliban to figure out, develop their channels of communication. Somehow or the other, we lay great stress with the Ashraf Ghani regime, and we did not. Which is why it came to a point that on 15th of August in 2021, when the Taliban walked into Kabul, by 16th, 17th, we had 2 evacuation flights and we pulled out completely. But then gradually, realization dawned that you couldn't be away. So after a year, we went back in and set up a technical mission. I mean, okay. But now you have to look forward and say that, all right, how do you upgrade the tactical mission? Whether you want to send in an ambassador or not, whether you want to formally, because then you may have to then accept a Taliban ambassador here. Now, that would mean many other countries have done that. China has done it, Pakistan has done it, Iran has done it, Russia has done it. So that's not the issue. So whether you want to call it an ambassador or whether you want to call it a diplomatic presence, or, I mean, that's a technicality. I won't get into that. You can pick and choose. But certainly you have to find a way of doing more with your presence in Afghanistan than what you are currently doing.
Thanks, Rakesh. I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but before we get to the Q&A, let me suggest something outlandish to both of you, and whether it is possible over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or whatever. We have no land access, India, to Central Asia. You remember a person called Babar. He must have come on horseback or camelback and fought the first battle of Panipat and so on. But we today do not have any land access. Central Asia is, as I said right at the beginning, very resource rich. What if we were able to convince all concerned to have a 10-kilometer, 5-kilometer wide road and rail access via what we call Pakistan occupied Kashmir to some point in the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan, and from there onwards to Central Asian nations. Nothing of this sort will happen overnight, but could this be one of the objectives that Government of India could aim for? And in the process, the line of control becomes the border. I know that for some kinds of government, this is a complete no-no. You have to keep saying that it's Pakistan occupied Kashmir and we'll get it back. I'm not entirely sure that that is feasible, as Rakesh has just pointed out, that Pakistan possesses nuclear weapons. So that's not something that you will get by force of arms. But here there is an economic incentive for all concerned, including what I'm told POK is on average much poorer than the rest of Pakistan. So for them there, of course, it's also sparsely populated. Is it possible in any kind of constellation of forces and events to conceive of something like this, to even point this out to some inverted commas, Western powers, that, this is in everybody's interest, including their interest, to push Pakistan. You can't push Afghanistan, but they might see some logic that they would benefit economically. What do you think, Vivek? First you, then Rakesh, briefly, and then we must have Q&A.
I think these are, forgive me for being blunt.
No, you must be blunt.
These are the kind of ideas that emerge in financing.
Rakesh and I are guilty.
They have no legs to stand on the ground. So
it won't happen.
I think Rakesh did a brilliant analysis, and I really have very little to add, except to remind ourselves, and this is something that we as Indians forget, that Pakistan is the product of the two-nation theory. You see, the Indian, leave alone contemporary time, the Indian intellectual class as it developed, starting from the Nehruvian period, stopped thinking in religious terms. And therefore, there was an amnesia about the origins of Pakistan. And it was looked upon as a normal territorial state which had broken away from us. It is not. Rakesh mentioned about a quest of identity. If you ask a Pakistani, at the end of the day, he will say, if you ask him, who are you? At the end of the, and you scratch him deep enough, keep questioning him, he'll tell you, I am what India is not. You read the Abbottabad Commission report, you know what Abbottabad Commission was. You read that report, and it says clearly India is a permanent threat and a permanent enemy. It doesn't use the word enemy, but permanent threat it does, and the inference is obvious. So here is a state which has defined its very existence in terms that are antithetical to you. You've tried everything for 75 years. Have you succeeded? Every prime minister, including the present prime minister. You haven't. Terrorism, we haven't used that word till now, but we must put it on the table, is not a strategic challenge. But it can cause immense problems and lead to strategic difficulty. I put it to you, and let's not forget this. The day Modi was sworn in for the third time, there was a terrorist attack in Riyasi. A bus was attacked. There were 53 passengers, only 9 died, fortunately. I'm saying fortunately in relative terms. What if the death toll had been 50? What would you have done? So you're dealing with an abnormal state. And you've got to fashion your policies on that basis. But somehow or the other, the Indian intelligentsia, the Indian academia, the Indian strategic classes have for very long, and I'm not talking in these linguistic terms. I mean, those of us who are professionals have dealt with Pakistan forever and ever. Know that you can do everything which a normal state would react in a cooperative fashion. You've been rebuffed. Kashmir is, to my mind, Kashmir is only a symptom. Musharraf, after he took over as army chief, said, even if Kashmir is resolved, our problems with India will continue because it's hegemonic. So let's not forget this. And when it doesn't make sense. You're talking of connectivity. Anyone in Pakistan would see that the economic benefits that would accrue to Pakistan if it had a cooperative relationship with us. Why don't they? That is the question I've always asked myself.
Okay, let's move on. Since in the interest of time, given that Netflix serial on IC-814, we have somebody here who actually went to Qatar. I know you don't want
You
to.
spotted him in the film.
So I know you don't want to talk about it, but just very briefly, because then we must have at least some Q&A. What would you have done differently if you were the last point as far as decision making was concerned? It's a long time after that. Would you have stormed the aircraft in Amritsar? Would you have not released Masood Azhar? All the questions that come to mind when you watch that Netflix series. And you don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
I think, Jaimini, you and I have always, at least, we are aware of a thing called the Official Secrets Act. I, for one, take it serious.
Okay, I got my answer.
Second, Netflix series, please ask the director of that series. He can answer. What can I answer?
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. You're taking the Secrets Act very seriously, too seriously, I feel, but that's all right.
Well, that's okay. I will never reveal what happened in a CCS meeting.
Okay, fair enough. We have to have dinner sometimes.
Even then.
I dropped something. I dropped my mic. Okay. Let's open the floor to everyone here in terms of Q&A. So we have only 10 minutes. So let's be very brief. We can carry on for another 5 minutes.
So we take it all the way up to 10 past or 15 past.
Okay, good. So somebody has the mic, and whoever puts up his or her hand first will get to ask the question. Any questions? Mr. Nyland here would like to ask a question. If somebody else's hand went up first, that person can get the mic.
Thank you, sir. Is it okay now?
And please mention to whom the question is addressed. If you have a particular person in mind, not me, of course, I'm not the subject expert. Either
No, no,
Vivek or
you have
Rakesh.
creative ideas of
Which are-
connectivity.
I'm Dr. Shalini Chawla from Center for APA Studies, and my question is for Ambassador Sood. Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure listening to you. You talked about the fact that our tactical strategy with Pakistan needs to evolve. So if we see it from 2016 onwards, we suspended the diplomatic dialogue. Then we have we did Uri, then we have evolved, we did Balakot. We then signed the ceasefire agreement, and then we are now meeting at the multilateral forum, but not discussing the bilateral issues. So where do you actually see the scope of more evolution? Because in the last 8 years, we see we have got much firmer in our messaging. But to Ambassador Katju's point, we have tried everything. So what more can we essentially do, and where is the space for more evolution of those strategy?
You
Go
want
ahead.
to answer? You want to take more questions?
That's not a bad idea. Yeah, let's have a few more questions so that then you can
Hello.
answer them.
Hi, this is Purushinder Singh from CUTS International,
Okay.
and thank you for the exposition. My question is to the panelists, which is regarding the energy security, especially to do with the TAPI, which is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. How are we looking at going forward in terms of energy security? Since you mentioned route, probably energy route to start with, and this was one of the things that was started. So how are we going about this? Thank you.
A third question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a follow-up related point. What have we lost by following the Modi government's broad approach of benign neglect of Pakistan, saying, you do what you want to do, and we don't adopt you. So has that cost us anything? That's a sort of sequel to that. My more substantive question is on Afghanistan, which either of you can answer, which is what is the likelihood and where is the natural process perhaps of evolving from a traditional economy to a more modern economy, meaning the process of creating a middle class of people wanting to do capital accumulation, all those processes that have taken place in so many other societies, which seem to be not happening in Afghanistan in any substantive measure. So is there any hope of that kind of transition, or it's just not going to happen?
One by one, whoever wants to start first. Vivek, you?
As far as energy security is concerned, I remember Karzai calling me in May of 2002 and asking me about TAPI.
About TAPI, okay.
I think we signed an agreement with the then Vice President Ansari went 2009. There was great hope then that something would emerge. But TAPI requires the stabilization of Afghanistan, and it's not stable. I told Karzai that then. I said it's a very good idea. I don't see Afghanistan evolving
Like the road
as nations in Asia and Africa, more in Asia, have evolved anytime soon. I think part of the problem lies in its ethnicity. Part of it lies in its lack of resources, which is it's really it's one of those chicken and egg things, because it has resource in the Hindu Kush. The estimates vary between 1 trillion and 3 trillion. I think Rakesh mentioned that the Soviets had done some exploration, and those some of those estimates are there. They are outdated. I think they'll have more. And the problem is that at the moment, anyone who can, anyone is leaving Afghanistan. So the people there don't see any future. And unless you have a class, an educated class, who see a future, who remain, I don't see what you. As far as tactical things are concerned, I've expressed my skepticism because perhaps it's the control of the army, and the army talked of geoeconomics at one stage. I think it was Bajwa who did so, when Mueid was one of the advisors. But I don't know whether it's corporate interests or whether it's this entrenched feeling that it's the guardian of Pakistan's ideology. Because way back, if my memory serves me right, in '96, Benazir, as Prime Minister, had a series of reports commissioned to show the economic and commercial impact of opening up with India. And I think there were 5 of those reports, which studied different sectors, said that opening up with India would be to Pakistan's great advantage. Only the white goods manufacturers and perhaps the two-wheelers, etc., had some reluctance. And that was '96. So everyone you talk to in Pakistan who's reasonable would say, yes, we should do business. And let me add this, something which will be of some interest. This is way back, not too far, I think 2018. At that stage, there was some hope that things were happening, jailing, and one retired general told me in Lahore, that, Vivek, do you know, I mentioned to him that I had seen a lot of development between the border, Wagah and Lahore, the ring road, and it was totally different from when Rakesh and I one evening in 1999 had traveled, if you remember, from the Mall Road to the border, and then in the evening we crossed over, and I saw total transformation. So I mentioned this to the general, and he said, do you know, a lot of Indians and Pakistanis together are buying land here to build warehouses. So I took a double take. I said, Indians? He said, yes, because, through Punjabs, there is people talk. And I said, how's money coming in? And then he told me, now don't be innocent. He meant, obviously, subterranean ways. So I think there have been these stages when people have thought in Pakistan that you must do it. But somehow when it comes to the crunch, there's a drawback. And I'm really waiting for the day when they open up economically and commercially. And if that happens and is sustained, I would really think that things are changing in Pakistan. And for that would mean that the army is changing, because at the end of the day, Pakistan is the army. You've seen what has happened to the constitutional package. I mean,
Rakesh, very quickly, if you want to add anything, otherwise
Well, I mean, what was said by Shalini and Nainan. See, I mean, earlier in a previous thing, Vivek had said that when he was referring to the Abbottabad thing, then how does Pakistan define itself in terms of, and he said, for Pakistan, it is non-Indian. I would go a step further. It became an issue for Pakistan. Their first constitution was only adopted in 1956.
Yeah.
Took a hell of a long time.
Yeah.
By that time, it had moved away from its democracy. I mean, it had moved away from by that
Ayub
time.
Khan was already president.
Yeah, that's right.
58 he did the
58.
coup,
No,
but
but
he
he was
was,
already
he
in the
was
cabinet.
both army chief and defense
Defense
minister.
was in the
That's what-
cabinet.
that's
No,
what-
no, so he was both army chief and defense minister. So Iskandar Mirza, all of that had already shifted from the political classes of Jinnah. Jinnah was dead, Liaquat Ali had been assassinated, etc., etc. And the big dilemma in Pakistan's constitution writing was basically, what is the objective of Pakistan? And that became, now, Islam had been the raison d'etre for the creation of Pakistan. But then at the same time, how much of a role will Islam have in policy formulation? And this is where the ulama came in very heavily in the objectives resolution and things like that. And since that time, there have been lots of water under the bridge. Many other constitutions have come, and so on and so on. But I think that battle was fundamentally lost by the time Bhutto and Zia came. And after that, there has been no reversal. Before that, Ayub tried to do some shifting of the objectives resolution and things like that. So for the army today, the identity is not just non-Indian, it is anti-Indian, because that fits in with its domestic role as not the guardians of the territorial integrity of Pakistan, but the ideological frontiers of Pakistan. And that is the army's role, the guardians of the ideological frontiers of Pakistan, not just the territorial integrity. I mean, in India, it is the constitution and our political leadership, which are the, who are responsible for the ideology of India and the ideological frontiers of India. So therein lies a difference. And I think that for the army, therefore, even though any objective analyst will say that as two nuclear weapon states do not, I mean, India would say we don't, Pakistan does not pose an existential threat to us, and vice versa is equally true. But for the Pakistan military, the temptation to posit India as an existential threat is much too great. They can't give that up. And
sorry.
no,
Please.
so and for them, therefore, they have, in a sense, even after nuclearization, it remains, because it is a domestic issue for Pakistan. Now, when I was talking about the strategic challenge and our inability to find a strategic solution, what is the challenge? I mean, you have the subconventional conflict, the terrorist conflict, etc., cross-border. It's not that you can't deal with it, but you don't have the resources. I mean, we've been facing it now for such a long time. In the 80s, it was the Sikh movement. From the 90s, it has been the J&K, Jammu Kashmir and elsewhere, including Mumbai and so on. Now, nuclear weapons are not going to deter these guys. So obviously, if they have to be deterred, they have to be deterred through intelligence, through covert action, through early warning, and through preemption. That's the only way. I mean, after all, even the so-called surgical strikes, I mean, you can debate what happened exactly. But what was the public statement that India put out on the surgical strikes after Uri? It was that we had hard evidence that terrorists were being assembled at these launch pads and they were being ready to come across, and we took preemptive action on the basis of real live intelligence and neutralized them, right? Balakot, after Pulwama, what was the statement that was put out? The statement was, we did not go after any military targets. We refrained from going after military targets. We had hard evidence of a training camp. There were 300 militants who were being trained there, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, this thing. And therefore, we went and attacked and killed those 300. So if we are talking of real-time intelligence and preemption, then preemption does not need to wait necessarily. if we have those capabilities, does not need to wait for an action to take place before we preempt something. Now, you should be able to do that regularly. Now, whether that can solve the problem or not, that's a different matter, but it requires the kind of capabilities which I do not think, and I don't think I'm violating Official Secrets Act. I don't think that we have those capabilities yet. So therefore, but what I said about tactical approaches is merely the conceptual point. The tactical approaches will last you as long as they will, and then they need to evolve. So you can keep oscillating between how much of dialogue, because it's only if you engage to an extent that the threat of disengagement acts as an incentive or disincentive. But if you are prepared to say that to hell with you, then you also lose that particular leverage. Because at some point, there has to be that. And meanwhile, you need to develop your capabilities. If you have the resources, I mean, if you have the resources, then that's it.
Vivek has been trying to get a word in edgewise.
For 75 years, we followed this idea that talks that come around, of course, augmenting your strategic capabilities is a given. Somehow it hasn't worked. That is why I think it's an abnormal state. But more than that, you and I were having a chat the other day, and Rakesh is the acknowledged strategic expert. I mean, I have no claims in that field or in any other field of expertise. But the thought which has always struck me is that once the Pakistanis acquired nuclear weapons, they turned nuclear deterrence on its head. Now, what do I mean by that? During the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviets never troubled sort of each other on their territory. There was no terrorism on espionage, yes. There was no terrorism on their territories. The closest the Soviets came was Cuba. The Pakistanis, I mean, I must confess, perhaps I was very naive. For a very brief period, I thought that now that in 98 the tests had done, and this was based on the Cold War.
And that's why you and I went to Lahore.
Yes, you're right. Both of us went there. So we thought, I took my cue from you. I thought that, let me share with you, I was a Pakistani colleague, and diplomats are colleagues. And I'm having a drink after a National Day reception, one Delhi hotel, and this after we'd both done our test. So I told him, I said, look, I think all this that you guys are doing must stop. I said, can you imagine that we are in Muzaffarabad? Can I imagine that you are in Srinagar? It is. I mean, it's now things are frozen. And that is because I thought that, look, nuclear weapon states don't do things on each other's territories, must do danger. And now that we are both out in the open, it'll be acknowledged. And that was from the Cold War. They did played games in Africa and in Southeast Asia and all over, in Latin America, but never on each other's territories. But they turned this on their head and they've used it as a shield. Rakesh can comment on this. But that's what I see. And I must confess, whatever you say, I'll accept immediately.
But before he says anything more, I think there are a few more questions. We are well over the time. Yes, let's have a last round of questions.
You talked about the issue of identity, that the identity is basically.
Sorry?
The issue of identity, that Pakistan is whatever India is not. How would you define the Bangladesh identity? It can't be Bengali because enough Bengalis on the other side. And can they also say we are what India is not? So what is their identity? And of course, things have happened in the recent past, but if you abstract from that, that if Pakistan's identity is what India is not, what is Bangladesh's identity? Because they were founded at the same time.
Somebody had a question there at the back.
I think.
Yes. No, but I think they put up their hand first.
Okay.
So we'll have one last question here. Sorry if somebody got left out. No, it's going to come to him. The gentleman here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the session, and you have also a big experience. What your expectation about Taliban? Is it continuous regime in Afghanistan in just the future few years? And what your expectation about the relation between India and Taliban and this year? You know about the Embassy of Afghanistan is closed several months these days, and there is some problems between the diplomat, part of them with Taliban and other with the former regime. Thank you very much.
Would you like to introduce yourself also? And you
I am Basim Hillis, Consular of Palestinian Embassy.
There's one person there, and has to be the last.
My name is Karni Singh. I just wanted to ask Mr. Katju that, there is you did refer to generational change and evolution of time, etc., and how Taliban was affected, the new leadership, etc. Is there not a generational change across, time in the thinking of Pakistan Army, or even to that extent in, the Bangladesh Army, which seems to have evolved and then regressed? So what's going on? How's the time play on these generations in the armies?
Okay. There's a lady there, so I can't say no to the lady there. But this has to be the last.
Thank you so much. I'm Aishwarya. I'm from Strat News Global. Probably any of our panelists can answer my question. Is it possible for India to verify officially that Pakistan is renouncing terror as a state policy? That's my
That should
question.
be quite easy to answer, but Vivek, do you want to go first? There were 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, starting with
I don't see
Rakesh
the
Mohan.
Taliban. Let me.
Rakesh Mohan had a question on Bangladesh.
On Bangladesh, I naturally, in my own sort of study of Pakistan, I studied deeply up to 71, and the factors that led to the creation of Bangladesh. And we know all those. After 71, I really feel that I'm not in a position to answer your question, quite frankly. Whether they feel that we as Bangladeshis are different from India, and to what extent. Obviously, they would. But before 71, to my mind, the critical factor was language. We in India know the attachment of the Bengalis to their language and to their culture. And there is a certain sort of continuum in culture, which cuts across communal and religious barriers. I think Jinnah forgot that. He just overlooked it in the imposition of Urdu, etc. And that, to my mind, was the beginning. And then, of course, came this whole idea that they were being treated as a colony. And finally, I think in 65, we did an absolutely masterful strategic move when we didn't open a front in East Pakistan. So that is one. Second, Taliban, I don't see the Taliban going away anytime soon. Whether the Taliban will evolve, there are indications that there are some pragmatists, the Haqqanis, etc., howsoever, whatever be their background. But still, at the moment, the hold of Hebatullah and his group is enormous. And theologically, they are the ones that are dominant. They haven't brought back Taliban 1. Either in the health sector, education, yes, but not in the health sector or the punishment according to the Sharia. That they've kept aloof. So, but quite frankly, I know that a little bit of opposition is growing, but I don't see that critical at this time or in the foreseeable future. Your question, ma'am, was about
India.
How do you verify?
How do you verify Pakistan will be terror state, and especially with
you verified.
Newspaper headlines.
You know it when you see it.
I don't think it'll be difficult. I don't think it will be difficult.
But like officially,
I can't give a certificate. Yeah, आज से बंद कर दिया. International relations, you'll know, your boys, your security boys will tell the government. We don't see any evidence. Or
Vice versa, yes.
पता चल जाए.
Rakesh, 1 minute. You have to sort of get. No, I'm joking, but go ahead.
I think, there are some basic contradictions again on this identity issue. The last election that was held before 1947 in undivided India was 1936. And this is one of the great ironies. The Muslim League won 109 seats at that time. It won 2 seats in undivided Punjab. 2. No seat in Sindh and no seat in NWFP. Baluchistan was very small because Kalat was independent, which was large part of Baluchistan. It won about 30 seats in what became East Pakistan, which is today Bangladesh, and Bengal put together, undivided Bengal. The rest of the seats were won in United Provinces, Central Provinces, and places like that. Now, when you drew the boundary line, when the boundary was drawn, it was the Muslim majority areas. So the first irony of the situation was that the Muslim majority areas said, we never voted for Muslim League. Well, we don't want this. So the support base of the Muslim League was where the Muslims were in a minority. Where Muslims were in a majority, which is what
They felt comfortable.
So, but this is curious. I'm not saying that how could it have been made different. So that is one of the things that led to that whole movement of people from one side to the other. Second, the people who went from here, the Muslim League supporters, were called muhajirs, refugees. They were always seen as different by the local Punjabis, the Sindhis, the Pashtuns, and so on. Till the 1980s, when they actually set up first a student movement and then their own political party, which was a pretty militant kind of a political party.
MQM and all.
The MQM and all that. Same kind of a thing. Urdu, he referred to Urdu, which sowed the seeds of distinction between East and West. Nobody spoke Urdu. Who spoke Urdu? It was the Muslims here. Otherwise, they spoke Punjabi, they spoke Sindhi, they spoke Pashto. There was no literature in Urdu. I remember going in 89 when I was posted to Pakistan. One of the first things that shocked me was I wear a kurta chudidar. So, I would wear that. And a lot of people said, "Aap muhajir hai." Chudidar is associated with muhajirs. So, but what I'm saying is, so there is this curious contradiction in terms of which adds to the complexity of the identity question. Now, for Bangladesh, it was able to define its identity in terms of anti-Pakistan at that point in time. Today, with its bouts with military rule, there is a confusion in its identity too. It doesn't have as clear an identity as it had when it emerged as a country in 1971. The Europeans used to have this definition of identity: common language, common religion, common enemy. By that token, Pakistan should be a perfect candidate to have its sense of identity, but it doesn't. I think I'll stop there.
Well, I think this, at least for me, I learned a lot from my two friends on my right and left. I hope it was the same for everyone in the room, and it was enjoyable too, with the odd quip here and there. And I'd like to thank both of you for taking the trouble to come all the way to CSEP. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I thank the audience for having the patience to be with us for such a long time. With that, I bring this. I didn't know about that, but thank you for reminding that there is some tea and coffee outside.